All, thank you for joining us today. Today's topic, the new landscape of safety and security. I think Daniel reminded us this morning that we sat here 8 months ago and discussed 2022, probably been the biggest event populated calendar that a number of us will have worked on. And we'll do a bit of a review of 22 before looking forward to challenges emerging for 23 and as we progress forward. But firstly, just a quick introduction. Myself, firstly, Chris Burr, Managing Director for G4S Events UK. Been operational in the industry for 17 years now. What started off as a pocket money, beer money while I was studying, progressed into what now has been an enjoyable career through various roles of operational management, regional management, into Managing Director most recently. Still challenging times, took on the role of Managing Director in March of 2020. Thought at that point everything was gone with the pandemic. However, some transition in COVID test centres, Nightingale hospitals, it became a bit more of a prosperous year for us. But really back into the thick of events now. The challenges of 22, lessons to be learned, and looking forward to 23, which is sure to be another exciting year. Introduce the panel as we go across to the left first. Peter.
Peter Sordy, Director of Health, Safety and Compliance for London Stadium. Been in the industry for about 23 years now. My first job was closing down the old Wembley Stadium. So if you liked that, I'm very sorry. But yeah, been in a number of other stadiums since then, and now the delights of working at London Stadium for the past 4 years.
Thanks very much. Phil Davis, Head of Safety and Security at the ECB. So been with the ECB for about 6 years. Prior to that, I was a police officer working in kind of public order, specialist operations and football policing. Now oversee our security operation across all our first-class counties, security around international teams, both domestically and some of the abroad stuff. We've had an interesting couple of years, so we did all the COVID stuff back in 2020. In fact, we locked this venue down as a biosecure venue back in 2020. Some interesting times there and going through some interesting challenges I'm sure we all are, particularly around crowds and so forth.
Good morning, everyone. Victoria Brooks. I've worked in the security industry now for around 10 years. Similar to Chris, I started as a steward in Manchester at the Arena and at the Manchester City Football Club, and then kind of worked my way through. Most recently, I've just finished on the Birmingham 2022 Commonwealth Games, primarily responsible for the planning, procurement, and delivery of private contract security, which was an enormous task, but one that I think we did well and we're quite proud of. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Really grateful for you all joining us today and giving us your experience and obviously a wealth of knowledge. In terms of 2022, reflecting back, I know certainly from a service security provider perspective, it was a daunting task looking ahead to the summer of 22. And that was the events that we knew about, notwithstanding some of the events that then presented unexpectedly. Really interested from your perspective, and if we go down the panel, just give us a quick overview of what challenges that you experienced, and more importantly, how do you think we can overcome those challenges moving forward? If you'd all give us one insight of one of the biggest challenges you faced during 2022, that would be really interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll go first. I think the most obvious one for kind of my work stream is the labour market and the temperament of the labour market, the way that it's fluid and it's changing and it's ever evolving. We went through a COVID pandemic which took away the events industry, and a lot of people went into static and manned guarding roles. And then obviously Brexit had a massive toll on the security industry and the availability of work. So I think that's been our biggest struggle, is the temperament of the industry, that those peaks and flows of staff availability and that kind of uncertainty of the availability and the nature of people that are available within the industry.
And from a Commonwealth Games perspective, correct me if I'm wrong, obviously G4S being a supplier, we have some insight, but the model you adopted was a split model, wasn't it, with a number of service providers? Was that a decision that was taken with the pandemic in mind, or was that something from previous major events experience, and assuming, reflecting back now, it was the right decision?
Yeah, definitely. It was started off in March 2020, so just 2 weeks before the pandemic started when we really started to develop that scope. And it was definitely a multi-supplier games based on previous experience and more of a risk-based approach of how do we mitigate the risk of a failure of private contract security more adequately, spreading that across different suppliers and ultimately different regions where those staff come from. As the pandemic evolved, I think a bigger lesson would have been the availability of suppliers within that. So to maybe have spread the suppliers a little bit more, looked at different regions of where we could source staff from, to maybe extend that multi-supplier more than we did.
Just for the avoidance of doubt, that's not my phone, Andy. That's your phone in your jacket. Thank you, Victoria. Phil, what about yourself? Anything sticks out from you?
Yeah, anything sticks out. So we came into 2022 really having been a little bit badly burnt at the back end of 2021 with the return from the pandemic. So we in cricket were the first big sport, big event to open up after lockdown in 2021, and we saw crowd behaviours inside cricket grounds that we wouldn't wish to see repeated. The 100 was quite a challenging event for us, whilst it wasn't there everywhere. Persistent, aren't they? Whilst we didn't say that everywhere, we certainly came in under quite a degree of scrutiny as to what we were going to deliver in 2022. So there was a lot of work went in over the winter into how we're going to mitigate and how we're going to look at the crowd behaviour challenges in particular. Whilst there are other things that have emerged during the summer, that was probably the main one for us. And that looked at, one is trying to understand that kind of COVID impact, what happened around crowd psychology and crowd behaviour, the reasons for it. So we brought some consultants in to start to do some work around that to understand it specifically, but because there was a need to deliver this summer, there was then quite a lot of work went into plans around crowd behaviour, how we can mitigate against that, alcohol management areas, but front and centre of that really is kind of stewarding and security. And how our contractor suppliers, how that quite complex model across cricket, where we've got 18 different counties plus the MCC, and they all operate a slightly different model for stewarding provision, how that works, because the stewards are the ones who actually have biggest impact on your crowds. If they're well managed, well led, well trained, well briefed, actually life can be easier. But equally, as we're all aware, there have been standards issues within the industry, resourcing issues around that. So working around those with our grounds and trying to raise standards wherever we can, trying to improve the quality of the staff, and also look at data. So particularly with this year set up systems to capture really good match day data to understand where our problems lie, which allows us to target more effectively, give feedback into grounds as to where to improve, and equally working on suppliers and standards going forward. So that's kind of been our big project over the year. But then we're seeing other threats emerge already. Protest, environmental protest particularly. We're looking at real issues over that probably going into next year. So it's a strange world, and it's ever evolving, and we've got to adapt to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting. And Peter, anything from yourself that's not been covered or similar themes?
I think it's wage rates is one of the biggest things, to be perfectly honest. You can work for Amazon or Deliveroo for £14 an hour, and so we're having to compete with that, I'm afraid. So we're now trying to increase our wages. Although we have a multiple steward suppliers, about 15 that we use, we're trying to grow the in-house section of the workforce from about 10% to 25 to 50%. But that is difficult in terms of retention, and as we've discussed, issues around Brexit. Some of the more reliable East European people who worked with us in security have disappeared, and trying to re-energise people into becoming a good steward, which, as Phil said, is incredibly difficult. We're asking so much of these people, and they're the single point of failure in your venue. They're asking them to be social workers, detectives, psychologists, and yet you're paying them £10, £12 an hour. So I think people do need to flip it on its head if you're expecting people like safety officers to take on huge responsibility for 60, 70,000 people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think most of us will be aware the gig economy continues to be tight. I think pandemic has exacerbated challenges across the security stewarding and the gig economy, and perhaps the pandemic is not the cause, but it certainly expedited the challenge that is amongst us. Current statistics showed 1974, I think, was the last time that unemployment was so low in terms of 3.5%. Peter, you kind of referenced wages and wages being low. I think there's two interesting points in that in terms of the cost of living crisis and whether that will naturally draw people looking for secondary income, perhaps back into that gig economy, looking to top up wages, but also what more can we do as a collective industry or as event organisers to recognise the value that these individuals bring and try and develop. Because I think, as a service provider, the obvious answer is we have to pay more. But, I think from an event organiser's perspective, there needs to be a collective effort of perhaps pay, but also learning and development. And one of the things I'm really keen on, I think both Victoria and yourself, Phil, referenced it, is that how do we get a better quality of steward, and whereby it is not a single service provider? Are any of you able to give us a bit of insight in terms of that learning and development and how you've approached that in terms of that multi-delivered service provider, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes obviously in the wage and how people are valued, but are they part of a team? It's a 0-hour casual industry, if we're honest, where people go to work for one supplier and then go to 4 other for the rest of the week, and there's not that sense of belonging. So that sense of investment from a supplier into the person, whether that is through learning and development. So what we tried to emphasise on the games was the MVQ level 3 spectator safety that staff could then use moving forward to go to other stadia and sports grounds to really make them feel like there's an investment in them, which in turn would hopefully help with the retention of that employee. But definitely through learning and development, I think the challenge is to get people on board with that. And how do you do that? And it's about that ethos and that value that they feel from the employer as a service provider. But it's a difficult one.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as Pete taught you, what we're expecting as stewards, actually that level 2 qualification or SAA is actually, we're paying minimum wage for this. And it's, it takes some effort to achieve it. What we'd like to see is there's a better pool of people out there who are motivated to acquire that qualification to do some casual work. It may be with cost of living crisis, there is more of a demand for people to come in for casual work that this offers, evenings, weekends, when the events industry operates. But how we can lift some of the barriers to that, how you can make that sort of level 2 stroke SIA a little bit more available. You can get a pool of people, particularly kind of student level, to become more of a casual workforce. Again, there are barriers to moving between different employers within this. Some of the complexities within the system, for example, like the SAA exemption for sports grounds, is quite an interesting one. That if you take here, there's actually a barrier between stewards who can work here and those who can work 500 yards down the road at Man United. And really, there shouldn't be. It should be one qualification that's transferable. But how we achieve that is probably more for government DCMS, pushed by the industry to take a lead on.
I think also, depending upon the safety advisory group that you have, they will place increasing demands upon a venue to say, well, you need more stewards to solve this problem. We're now running at about 1,200 to 1,300 stewards for a low-risk game, rising to 1,400 stewards for a high-risk game. Now, trying to get all of those when you have clashing games, clashing venues, and more demand from other events across the capital, in my case, is a tough gig. Now, I know that there are colleagues who are developing software to electronically engage with stewards and actually develop them and brief them. But the complexity of that is you've got in-house, then another 15 companies that you're trying to standardize the way that they learn about the event and learn about the venue. So yes, an interesting problem, as Phil has said.
Absolutely. I think the labour challenge is certainly going to be a continuation through 23 and onwards. And I think, like you say, I'm sure we could talk about it all day long, perhaps without coming up with any solid solution. But I think key themes in that is investing in the workforce. And making them feel valued, I think, is something that certainly we've seen huge benefit in. Some of the events and venues that we operate, things such as lunch bags, treating people right. Perhaps the wage can't be simple, but giving them a lunch bag, making them feel part of that organisation, I think goes a long way. And that value, that loyalty to the venue rather than perhaps the service provider, is certainly something that we would echo as reflective. I think you kind of began to broach on technology in terms of technology linking learning and development and technology linking perhaps workforce management. Interested if anyone's got experience of workforce management platforms, utilisation for your match day stewardings.
Yeah, absolutely. We use a system called Venue Aware, and it's got people in the States and the UK at Arsenal as well. It is a good system. It's got its downfalls in other places, but we've gone from a paper-based system 4 years ago with wristbands to a fully fledged, every single person is scanning in via this system now. So we tie them all down to the hours. It's related to payroll, helps you control your costs, and hopefully removes fraudulent behaviour. So.
I think it's definitely a lesson learned from the games, because we had that multi-supplier allocation. the workforce management systems was of the suppliers, so everyone had a different system, integrating that into the organising committee who I worked for and getting that real-time data, getting that information, and particularly during games to know your safety numbers. So, for example, I was in a command centre, I wasn't on venue, so when you're trying to assess if the 19 venues have opened on time without that live data, because there's so many different systems, was quite difficult. So I think it's definitely a lesson learned of integrating those systems. I think particularly like Peter, having one system, if you are a client, that you can see all of that labour supply on.
Makes sense. And I guess, we've spoke about the importance of stewarding and the ability to service events, but ultimately, Daniel referenced that point of nothing beats attending a live event, but I think that's only relevant and pertinent if the experience is right. And again, when we talk about technology, I'm keen to kind of understand there's a number of systems and different technologies that have come to market, some more recent than others, and I think we've got a number of providers in the room today. But in terms of Evolve systems, for instance, in terms of frictionless screening and searching access into venues, and is this something that as major operators experienced across the industry, you see as something that's going to be more prevalent as we move forward and support perhaps reduction of workforce and greater safety and security at events?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of picked that up. From looking across a number of major venues, yes, it's kind of aspiration. You want to look at this technology, but I've spent several years sort of looking into that, and actually, you get to a point where you're still going to have staff on the ground, even when you've got sort of remote search technology systems getting in there. You've still got to support that with staff to intervene when you've got hits, fines, and so forth. So actually, whilst I like some of the concepts of it, and I think there is work to do in this area, I've seen a number of pilots, but never anything that quite delivers. But actually, there's nothing sort of replaces that understanding of stewards on the ground who can see crowd behaviour, pick up sort of how people are operating, how they're coming in, and that actual movement around. So it can support that, but I don't think you're going to get to a stage in the short term where we'll replace it.
I think that's true. We've used Chia Arches before at Major League Baseball. We are looking at the Evolve system, and I know Chia have introduced a new Open Gate system. But a lot of these are American orientated, primarily looking at firearms and heavy metal objects. And a steward doing a body search can at least try to find hidden alcohol or hidden plastic or ceramic weapons if they're doing the searching properly. But it's impossible because they're not searching a person's private areas, and as a consequence, it's only ever going to be a 95% search. So the biggest thing is about deterrent, and the second biggest thing is about reducing the amount of casualties should something bad happen. So I know we'll probably come onto it, but Zone X and the Protect Duty will have that kind of onion layer of trying to deter people around a venue. So
You probably just add the technology can't say hello, welcome to your venue, and have a great day, and tell you where the toilets are.
I think one of the advantages to the technology is where you use it in your kind of risk areas, and it being a risk-based approach. So on the games, we had multiple venues that were in lockdown, so they had a defensive search by the police and military, and then it was ensure that the integrity of that venue was clean at all times. So we had analytics on the CCTV cameras, we had PIDs on the perimeter line protection, which actually mitigated thousands of staff that we would have had on line of sight around some very large venues. So I think it's very much a risk-based approach based on, the type of event and the venue you've got.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think both through the live period and perhaps out with the live, we talked about behaviour of spectators at events, and perhaps that reawakening of the events industry drove a culture of people excited to get back out, overindulgent perhaps in alcohol, and we've seen some behaviour that perhaps wasn't expected. Specifically cricket, I think, was an example you referenced, but I don't think it was reflective only of cricket. I think it was across the industry. But there are also challenges which we see more and more in terms of TikTok not advisors, but people breaching perimeters, and social media people looking to try and, I guess, showcase vulnerabilities. Is that something that the panels had experience of, and any experience of measures to try and mitigate, I guess, more importantly?
We've had them in our venue. You probably all laughed at seeing various venues of people saying, look how I sneaked into Stadium X. It happens to all of us. Seems to be my place quite a lot, but is actually creating, a ticket holders only perimeter. But again, that's about staffing, it's about barriers and infrastructure, and it's the kind of thing that you would normally have only on a major games like Commonwealth Games. And so we try to create an external barrier which now says, onto the island you can now only have ticket holders only. There's supposed to be a service whereby local residents are able to cycle round and run round, etc. But we've now had to say, no, we can't do it anymore because of young kids trying to skinny through turnstiles or TikTok people. We've even had, though, one person with mental health issue actually swimming across one of the canals in his pants to break into the stadium. So I think it's sometimes like moths to a flame. People want to be where the big event is happening and then get that reflected glory.
Yeah, I mean, predominantly our issues have been around field of play, incursion in particular. We had one particular YouTube prankster, I won't name, he's had enough publicity, but challenging that and also having effective measures in place. I mean, in that case, with some pressure, we finally got him brought to court for an aggravated trespass, and he's actually got a criminal behaviour order now to prevent him going into any sports venue. So being able to take measures like that, work with police and authorities, Crown Prosecution Service to get court results for us, but actually how you mitigate against that. Everyone comes up, says, oh, it's the security's failed, but actually proportionality of security you put around a field of play perimeter, cricket perimeters, 500-600 metres, circumference is huge. Trying to protect all that at a proportionate level that doesn't involve a steward every 5 yards is very difficult for us. So in practice, actually having measures that mitigate against people coming in now. One of the other areas we've seen really well with that is the intelligence sharing across the industry. So as we were facing those issues, we talked to tennis, we talked to Wimbledon, we talked to the RFU, we talked to the O2. And actually, I think working across the industry that we all share that intelligence, that we work together across it, and lessons learned, because at the end of the day, we're actually all in this together, and we're all kind of promoting UK events, UK industry, as to how well we can do it and how professional we are.
Yeah, I think that intelligence sharing, information sharing is critical to the success and the best practice. And I think there's some real good examples across the security and stewarding industry of where organisations share information, and there's some real challenges. I think interoperability, we talk about now, Peter, I think you referenced 15 suppliers perhaps on one venue. I think, security stewarding suppliers are working closer than ever, but there's no doubt there's still challenges to overcome, and I think others in the audience would kind of support that view. Peter, I think you mentioned protect duty. It would be remiss perhaps not to touch on it given the title of the panel, but I think there are people certainly much better qualified and informed than I am to give an opinion. I think there is some great frustration. The instability of government, for instance, ain't going to support that. But if anyone on the panel wants to give a quick comment on where we think we are with that, or what lies ahead, or do we want to just pass that section over?
No. Perfectly reasonable. I think since the Olympics in 2012, there's the whole issue around the wider area, the last mile principle, and that's pretty much the way that the protect duty is surrounded. So we're kind of doing it. A lot of venues are kind of doing this already. They're already having wayfinding or a string of breadcrumb staff on the way to the venue looking for things that don't look right. We have a hermetically sealed kind of road closure area, which goes in 3 hours before we open the doors, and we have early teams who scan areas for things that don't look right. It worked particularly effectively the other day. 3 of our staff working for a steward contractor spotted guys stealing a petrol can from a contractor's vehicle, spotted that they actually had firearms on them as well. They may have been imitation ones, but the police ARVs turned up incredibly quickly. And I think police are very conscious about this already, even though the law's not there. I think one of the things is, who is the protect duty protecting? Is it protecting the public attending the event, or all of the buildings in the surrounding area? So I think all of the buildings and stakeholders surrounding venues need to begin to contribute towards some way of funding the extra measures for the protect duty. It shouldn't just be the venue. So I think that's and also the way that insurance covers the staff working on the event is absolutely critical. And we have a multi-stakeholder control room with 4 or 5 different organisations sharing CCTV feeds. So that linkage is a critical component to the success of the event.
Yeah, I quite agree. Pete, I think Protect Duty seems to have been in a holding pattern for this for a couple of years now. It will come, I'm sure, and many of the measures that were within there, the major events, we're probably already dealing with. But I think the point you raise around the Zone X grey space, whatever you want to call it now, around there, whose responsibility it is. I think that the concern for me is that continually getting pushed back on the event organiser who don't actually control that space. So the responsibilities of local authorities, police, but also the other businesses that operate in those areas, as to how all these integrate to provide a sort of a safe space, safe Zone X that's coordinated across all the issues across that. Some of the London areas, actually mostly we get more complaints about issues at the tube stations than we do at the cricket grounds, which are clearly well beyond our control. Where we go with this, be interesting to see how it does. I've also got concerns about the smaller venues. It's great, places like this, major venues, but actually when you get down to smaller venues who will be still be subject to these requirements as to how we implement that at a lower level, where there is still some vulnerability depending on what businesses, what activities you've got there.
Yeah, I think it definitely emphasises on that multi-agency approach, the RACI, who's responsible, who's accountable for all of that space, in the Zone X and beyond, because although it's a venue that's hosting the event, that is public realm. So who is responsible? Where does that funding come from? And how do those multi-agencies integrate? How do they work together? What's that operational planning look like? I think it was definitely a challenge that we had on the Games because of the spread of the venues across the West Midlands, different boroughs and different councils and different train stations and different police services. It's definitely a big task, but it's definitely important, as we've seen, to make sure that area is clear.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we started off by reviewing 22. I guess from my perspective, I'd be interested to know, looking forward, 23, whilst threats don't tend to go away, unfortunately. Is there anything, particularly that we've experienced or that you think we need to be considering as we look into 23?
I'd like to be able to put away the bolt cutters that I've got stationed around the ground to stop people chaining themselves to goalposts. That would be something I would look forward to. No, I think increasing use of technology, use of investigation officers. I've got a guy who's almost full-time CCTV tracking people from stations through turnstiles to the point of their poor behaviour and then tracking it back again. That person's going to cost anything between £35,000 to £45,000 a year just for him. But getting the message to fans about the consequences of their behaviour is something I'm working with West Ham very closely on. That's the thing that I think we need to get out there. Yes, they might be under the influence of something, but if we can get into their heads about this thing has real-world consequences. The guy who ran on the pitch the other night against Anderlecht was a Canadian tourist who'd bought a ticket. He wasn't a season ticket holder. He ran on the pitch, made gestures, and didn't help the whole situation. People don't know that he spent 2 days in police cells and was fined £120. And to me, actually, the fining of pitch incursion people is poor. The CPS needs to increase it significantly because it's not a deterrent at the moment. So yes, there's a huge amount of things in terms of control measures, using technology to track people. We've found the use of body cams has been incredibly helpful. We have 60 of those. I need to increase it to about 80 or 100. And also the use of Dallmeyer cameras in our venues has been fantastic. We need more of them, but they're incredibly expensive.
I guess if I'll just echo that last point, we're looking at a big investment in Dallmeyer CCTV across major cricket grounds, but great tech, but pretty expensive, so it's a big investment in there. For me, looking forward into 2023, when we're trying to build on the success for this year, and I think, we also need to actually congratulate ourselves. We actually had a pretty decent 2022. For all the challenges that came into it, we've come out of it. From my point of view, actually the cricket was mainly what was talked about. Some of the off-field stuff, but actually thankfully not crowd behaviour or security issues. So actually we've done pretty well through some challenging times, and I think the industry as a whole needs to keep that in perspective whilst keeping to look to improve. Continue with the crowd behaviour themes. I mentioned kind of the risk around environmental protest is a real concern for us going forward, similar to your bolt croppers and people potentially gluing themselves to gates or running on the pitch and protesting. All these are big concerns for us. Standards across the industry, though, and from a governing body perspective, that's to look to set standards and ensure that our venues have a means of quality assuring the staff that are within their venue, how they're performing, but also how they're briefed. And I'm also a big believer that this is not just about security. Actually, great performance in the venue and great security is also about great service. It's about bringing all your F&B together. It's about how the whole venue operation works, both inside and externally. And often in security, you need to be influencing those areas to make sure they're not creating a problem for us to try and solve down the line. And we often see the sort of the commercial versus security pressures. The big one is how much alcohol you're selling. We're doing a lot of work around alcohol management to try to get that into a sensible position. Those are, whatever happens in 23, economic pressures, who knows what state the UK is going to be in next year. Hopefully better than it is this year, but we'll see. Ever evolving, and we've got to be agile to those threats.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think given the past few years' history, none of us can predict what's going to happen in 2023. But I think what we can do is just start to look at the efficiencies of the security posture. Are we getting those basics right? How can we perfect that so that the little things from the ingress from the train station to the search lanes, are the search lanes set up correctly? Is there big queuing times? How do we get people through smoothly, securely, to then ultimately improve that customer experience and that spectator journey, but then also manage that crowd behavior? Setting those expectations early on that it's smooth and it's clear, to kind of manage and mitigate any frustrations from queues or frustrations from not being able to get in efficiently because someone searched your bag wrong. And I think technology can help with that, particularly with mag and bag and archways and, x-rays where necessary, where it's risk deemed, but definitely just perfecting those basics to try and smooth that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that crowd safety by design is kind of critical to it, isn't it, in terms of customer experience. If it starts off badly, 9 times out of 10 it's going to progress to a bad experience and bad behaviour. Whereas, if we can have that positive experience, it plays a number of roles in terms of positive experience, feedback, but also positive engagement. The power of the hello is, a phrase that's regularly used in terms of making sure we engage positively with people to get that strong posture, but also kind of multi-valued. In terms of, we've got probably about 2 minutes left in terms of ourselves, and I think we've been asked to open up to the floor for the final 5 minutes. So, I think there's 2 questions certainly in my head that are left. I think both are challenging to answer, but if one of the panel would like to consider up, if you had a silver bullet, what's one thing that you would change to benefit the industry? I think you'd all like to answer that, but if you want to give us a bit of a view of what that one change you would make that you think would make a significant improvement on the safety and security landscape of 23 onwards.
I think you ought to ask all 3 of us. I think one is unfair, because I'm sure we'd have slightly different opinions. I think it's you mentioned it yourself, clarity over the way that staff should be regulated, qualified and trained. The method by which level 2 stewards have to secure their qualifications, the increasing absence of government grants for training stewards. If you're a student of archaeology and you've just qualified, you can't get a grant to train that person as a steward. So there's a whole bunch of things. Is why can't we access the student market for student training grants? And also, there's a whole bunch of people who are not employed or are refugees in this country. Why can't we access that labour to be event staff?
Yeah, and if you're going to take one thing, anything that improves stewarding, better pay, better qualifications, better standards, would make the biggest difference. They're the ones who really interface with the public, make the biggest difference to our events, and if they're well led, well managed, well motivated, well paid, they're going to be better. But there are challenges, as we all know.
Yeah, I think on a similar theme, I think for me it would be distinguishing event security. So, now we use the level 2 door supervisor license, but I think looking at the role of an event security, varying to the door supervisor and actually creating that diversity within the workforce, we really struggled in some aspects, but also excelled to increase the diversity of women in security, for example. But I think defining event security away from door supervisor and kind of bouncers and that kind of culture might see a change in the industry and the people we've got.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. I did have the stats, but I've misplaced them actually. But I did think that it's something, Victoria, I think the Commonwealth Games were really proactive on trying to drive in an increase in making sure of the right number of females, particularly around that search area, which we know is a challenge across the industry. I think we've spoke a lot about challenges. Not going to kind of do the wrong thing in terms of timekeeping, but Andy did ask us to continue on for a bit longer, so apologies if anyone's keen to go, you can go, but he's asked us just to run on a little bit longer. So I guess, I'm very keen to focus on the positives as well. I think, the UK industry is as a whole is a very positive industry. I think there was sincere and real challenges facing us in 2022, but when you reflect back on what has been achieved, some of the major events that did take place, the lack of major challenges that were presented, is a good reflection of some individuals and organisations and multi-agency stakeholders that are operating within the industry. And I suppose, again, from the panel, be keen to understand, what do you think it is that the UK industry does really well and could kind of support and educate perhaps Europe or the wider world in terms of those good practices?
This is just in sequence. I think the SGSA, although they make my life painful sometimes on persistent standing, I'm not sure if there's anyone in here from there at the moment, but they are incredibly good at being consistent about guidance. I think the UK is a world leader in terms of crowd safety management. If you look at the way that some European fixtures are managed in terms of policing, they begin from day one with a highly aggressive stance, whereas the UK take a stewarding and then a graduated response stance. So I think that's one of the things that the UK does incredibly well. I know that some of the planning around the World Cup, has a lot of UK crowd safety people have assisted with that planning process. If it all goes wrong, then that will be a problem in terms of their reputation. But no, that kind of consistency and also keeping your head when things are going wrong and not panicking. So there's a famous Douglas Adams book where the metaphor is don't panic. I know it was Corporal Jones as well, for the older ones among you, who said don't panic, but that's the critical thing when something starts seeming to knock your event sideways, is don't panic. So we had all that stuff that happened the other night with Anderlecht. 15 minutes before kickoff, we had a bomb threat and dialed to 999 with the police. Then a steward discovered an unattended bag in a stand, which he didn't do the HOTS process properly, but it was then called through to take everybody to a standby level. Within 17 minutes, it was stood down, thank goodness. But those two things happened, that were completely unconnected, but all staff did their jobs properly, carefully, safely and securely, and the event carried on. And apart from a bit of seat throwing and some flares, it was all good.
Yeah, I mean, you said what we do well. I think the UK benefits from a real cadre of very top-end event professionals. Events like this where we all come together and share experience and practice, I think, are brilliant, and that's what we do well. Some of Pete's point, unless you've worked behind the scenes, you see that thing happening on TV and it looks great. You don't realise what's going on behind it. And we could all tell tales about we had this, that, and the other happening. My particular favourite from this year, so we were fortunate enough to, I suppose, have a test match taking place at the Oval when Operation London Bridge happened. We've been planning for this for God knows how many years. Actually happens during one of our worst case scenarios, which is a test match in London. Actually on the morning of the resumption of the game on the Saturday, whilst we were doing all this wonderful stuff with the anthem, singing God Save the King for the first ever time and all the rest of it, behind that we are dealing with two environmental protesters who were threatening to come into the ground and set themselves on fire in the middle of the pitch. So you've got all the security staff running around doing all those things in the background, and it looks amazing on TV. And I think we are great at delivering that. And from, if you look through from the Olympics forward, and then there was the Com Games up in Glasgow, you've had the Com Games this year. We get better every time with this. We've got the ongoing events that, Pete at the London Stadium, myself with all the, the cricket, the Ashes. We've held a couple of global events in recent years. We've got World Test Championship final coming up next year, and and these are all going to be amazing events, well executed, well delivered, and the public, I think they're fantastic. But we all know we've done a lot of work behind the scenes to make and to deliver them.
Yeah, I think, again, similar theme, but I think it's that we're not complacent. We're constantly challenging the norm, challenging how we do it to ultimately make sure that people have that safe and secure experience that they're coming for. I think it's easy to get into that system where it's mundane and you've always done it this way, so why would you change it? But actually not being complacent, looking at your risk assessments. Is it appropriate? Is it relevant to what you're dealing with? Is it appropriate to that match or that event? And definitely just challenging those norms of how you've always done it might not actually always be the most effective way, both in service or kind of, commercial aspects. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think, just to summarise and kind of conclude on that point, it's something that resonates with me around. There's a great pride, there's a great recognition of what we do, but I think Peter, you referenced people understanding what goes on in the background, and the same with you. Things look great on the television, perhaps people don't understand it, and there's maybe something in trying to celebrate that success, trying to demonstrate what trained individuals can do, and kind of that phrase of making security and stewarding a bit of a career. Yes, the wages need to go up, and yes, we need to perhaps move away from casual contracts and zero-hour contracts, but there's definitely something linked to that it's an attractive industry to work in. It's definitely something that we should try and attract more talent into. I think Andy putting his finger up was one question for the room, was it? More than one, sorry.
Good morning, Ben Bowen from HAP Solutions Group. We are a temporary workforce provider, labour provider, providing to stadiums, venues, major festivals to help them on their peaks on these big events, the gig economy stuff that Victoria you mentioned before. I think what we see is we have an availability of workforce. We have keen people wanting to work in that 18 to 25 range, wanting to get into security, get into these roles. I think what we have right now is we have that challenge that you mentioned around the qualifications. We want people to do the level 2 qualifications. It's quite expensive. It's got a significant cost associated with it. And we don't have contracted revenue because of the nature of the beast that we go into peak games. We've got a gig economy workforce. Like Victoria said there, people work for you for a short period of time. I think there needs to be some conversation around funding of that qualification, either reducing the cost of that, the grants that Peter mentioned, or contracting revenue so that businesses like ours can sit there and go, right, we're going to make the investment into that, knowing that we've got some contracted revenue along the line that supports that. Because I think fundamentally there are people out there. I know we've got thousands of people ready to work every week that work for us across the country, but definitely the challenge of getting them qualified in a cost-effective way and need venues, event organisers, rights holders potentially to support that and drive some of that. That's my comment on that.
Yeah, I think it's a really good, valid point, and I think it's that point of, there was a phrase in our industry that used to be called bodies or jackets. It's horrible, and we should be calling them colleagues and our staff or our workforce. But it's that position of, as you say, identifying that workforce, but making sure they've got the right skills to do the job. Because I think part of the challenge we've seen is people's response to risk is to ask for more, but putting more people in who are perhaps not venue familiar, not trained in itself can create more of a risk. So I think it's that balance of what is the proportionate number and how do we access that funding to get people into the industry, but making sure they are trained. Site familiarizations, inductions, and whether technology moving forward can help with that. I think, society is much more app-based. My son is 9. Everything has to be in his hand or he doesn't do it. Very, very tech-savvy, and I think, we need to make sure that we're making it easy. There's a benefit to having classroom-based training, but it needs to be balanced with the availability of it. Peter?
I think also it's the issue around stewards' lives and how the part-time work might fit in with their lives. Stewards used to come to work at 3 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon, and it would fit with their day job. When I was at Norwich, I used to have a cabinet maker, a guy. All these guys did these normal day jobs, and then they did that every week. Now, the timing of kickoffs, the days of the week, the every times on Saturday and Sunday means it can't fit in with their normal lives. So.
Right. I'm sorry to cut you off there. You've been brilliant. Chris, fantastic moderating as ever, and thank you, G4S, for your ongoing support. I think that we should thank the panel in the appropriate manner.